I got started in animal rights in high school in 1987, and been doing this a very long time. And over the years, as I would talk about what happens to non-human animals, I would also start talking about what happens to humans as well. And as a Hispanics, which means I'm a very proud Mexican, I started talking about farm worker justice issues. And I would talk about other food justice issues that I learned about. And many in the animal rights community were not too pleased with me starting to talk about human rights issues. So eventually, I started Food Empowerment Project as a way to show that there is no need to make a choice, that you can fight for the rights of human and non-human animals collectively because they are all connected, especially when you look at where our food comes from. So that's how I started Food Empowerment Project. I actually started it in San Jose because where I lived and where I worked in San Jose, I had two liquor stores across the street from each other. And one of the areas I'd been hearing about what was at the time called food deserts, which are communities that lack access to healthy foods. And I'll talk about it more later, but started to realize that this problem was also inherent in an absolutely wealthy community like the Silicon Valley. I'm somebody who's done investigations of factory farms and slaughterhouses. I've seen firsthand what happens to non-human animals, and that's where I'd like to start my talk. This is my bunny, and my husband's here, so I guess we collectively share companionship with this little critter. His name is Benito. He's actually not named after Bad Bunny. He's named after Benito Juarez, who was the first indigenous president of Mexico. And we actually found him downtown San Jose, if you know where the Hensley area is. We found him on the street out there. And more than likely, he was dumped as, people buy rabbits for Easter. And then as they get bigger, they don't want them anymore. So he was dumped on the streets. And for me, I'm showing Benito not only because he's adorable and I love him, and everything I'm going to show you is not show, I don't show graphic images, but everything I'm going to talk about is a little bit on the darker side of where our food comes from. But Benito to me exhibits why we believe in veganism. And that's because Benito has a right to his flesh without worrying about somebody wanting to consume him. He has a right to his fur without worrying about somebody wanting to wear him. He has a right to his eyes and his skin without worrying about somebody testing products on him. That veganism is holistically something that looks at animals as individuals and the rights that they have not to be harmed by humans. And we have an obligation to be there to protect them. Now, I'm saying that, which I'm assuming, and I'm making an assumption, being in Los Gatos, that it's pretty much most of us have the privilege of deciding where we buy our food and how often we eat. And so to me, we have an obligation to further that and make sure we do the least harm that we can possibly do. And that includes non-human animals in that equation. Now, a lot of times when we talk about, not consuming animals, a lot of people have different notions on what that means. One of which is that cows give milk, and they're not being killed in the process. So what's the harm in that? And one of the things for people to always remember is that cows are mammals. So that mama cow is only giving milk when she's pregnant, just like a human animal would. So in order for her to give appreciable amounts of milk in order to be commercially viable, she's constantly impregnated. And what they do with those babies here in California is one of two things. One is they're immediately taken to auction houses, such as the one I visited in Petaluma, where the baby male calves are actually auctioned off or their umbilical cords are still wet. And they sell for maybe $3 to $12, and they go directly to the slaughterhouse, which in Petaluma is very close to where the auction house is. Other times, because as you all probably know, in California, we really don't have a veal industry where they would keep the calves in crates 4x4, chained by the neck. We don't have that in California. Prop 2, which actually many of you who are here was on my Prop 2 team. So thanks for all your work on that. Did away with that type of confinement system. So what ends up happening to a lot of them is they end up getting taken to places like Harris Ranch. If any of you have ever driven down the 5, Harris Ranch. A lot of times what they're trying to do in California is they're trying to see if they can make these cows viable for selling for meat, basically. because there's two types of animals who are raised, one for milk and one for their flesh. What a lot of things that's not talked about beyond the fact that the mom is only going to give milk is that no matter what, the mom and the babies have to be separated, because no matter how big or how small that dairy farm is, they do not want the babies with the mom, because the babies are going to drink the mama's milk, and the farmers want to sell that milk. So they're separated. And I've documented with video cows crying back and forth to each other, horrific cries from the baby wanting to be with their mama. And this is inherent in the industry. There's no way about it. It doesn't matter how small the farm is, they're separating them. Here in California, if you've ever driven the 99, you can see it in Sonoma County, you can see it other places around the state, but you will still sometimes see these little hutches. They're like little white hutches, and there's calves inside of them. And those are the females. And the females are also kept in confinement. I've videotaped female calves chained by the neck, who have kicked over their water or their food in the Central Valley, and they die because they don't have access to water. I've also videotaped too, trying to clean each other's faces as they're separated in these hutches. And this is where they put the females, because again, they don't want them expending too much energy, because they would have to feed them more or do more work. So not until they're of age to be impregnated do they join the larger herds that maybe many of us see when we're driving down the highways. But no matter what, the industries who raise and kill animals for food are doing so for profit. They do not care how bad it is for the planet, certainly don't care how bad it is for the animals, and they really don't care how bad it is for our health either. Food Empowerment Project, we have some resources. Again, I'm Mexican, so I'm very proud of my heritage. And so we created a website called veganmexicanfood.com, which is in English and in Spanish. One of my colleagues is Filipina, or former colleagues is Filipina. So for her heritage, we have veganfilipinofood.com, and that's in English and Tagalog. And one of our board members, who was actually our first intern, is Lao. So we created Vegan Lao Food, which is in English and in Lao. But again, this is a way for us to show, for those of us who are, are different than this typical type of vegan food that you see promoted. This is a way for us to show our culture and our heritage, and share these recipes to be proud of our ancestors, but also without the animal suffering. When we talk about veganism and we talk about, the cruelty inherent in it, Food Empowerment Project always wants to make sure that we talk about all of our food in this lens. That just because something is vegan doesn't mean it's cruelty free. So just because something doesn't include any type of animal product doesn't mean that there's no suffering involved in it. And this is why we look at chocolate. We look at chocolate as is what it is, right? It's a luxury item. I know many of us may think that luxury is a necessity, but it's actually just a luxury, right? It is something that we do not need. And what happens for chocolate right now, this isn't what I'm going to be talking about, is right now. It's not something that happened 10, 20, 30 years ago as new. This is something that's been going on for 20, 30 years and is still going on. And that's that you have children who are basically enslaved. So two different areas. One is Western Africa, where you have children who are, as young as 6 years old, working in the cacao fields. And basically, they are stolen from marketplaces to work in the field. A lot of them come from countries nearby, Burkina Faso and Mali, where they're incredibly poor countries. And what's happening is that the children are thinking that they're going to work and be able to send money back home. So they get into the industry and then they never see their families again. Other times, very poor countries, sometimes the family member will sell a child into the industry because they need the money. And again, other times children are actually stolen and kidnapped and trafficked in this industry. And what happens is that they're sometimes trafficked hundreds of miles from home, where they don't even speak their local dialect. These are children who are supposed to be in school, and they are nowhere near school. So in these areas, you have children who are carrying very heavy bags of cacao pods. So maybe a 10, 13-year-old being forced to carry about 100 pounds. And if they're not moving fast enough, they're beaten. The children are sometimes locked in at night, and if they try to escape, they're severely beaten. Research came out through lawsuits that were recently taken place against Hershey and Mars and some of the big companies, where formerly enslaved people talked about the fact that sometimes the bottoms of their feet would be cut open in a means to prevent the children from running away. And all of this is done for chocolate. Now, this is primarily in Western Africa. In Brazil, we have a similar situation taking place where you have children. It's interesting. When we started doing this work 15 years ago, it was pretty much Western Africa. And in the past 3 to 5 years, Brazil is now showing up in all the US Department of Labor statistics on slavery and child labor for chocolate. And a lot of theirs is what you'll hear a lot of time is that, oh, they're helping their families. You know, these are children who are helping their families. And while that may be true, it doesn't necessarily mean that that's something that the parents really want the children to do. The fact is they're not being paid well enough, and they feel like the children have the farmers have absolutely no choice but for their children to be working it so they can make an income. So one of the growers actually said, like, I feel like there's a rope tied around my neck. I'd rather my child be in school. You know, and the solution for this is, from my perspective, is pretty simple, right? We have to be paying them a living income. These corporations based in the US, based in the West, are basically not paying these growers, these farmers, adequate amounts of money in order for them to be able to do the work that they do and to provide the enormous salaries for these corporations here in the West. So what we have created is that in order to help people, we have a list of chocolates that we do and do not recommend based on the country of origin. We do not go based on any of the certifications because every single certification at this point has been found to be problematic. The Washington Post a few years ago came out with a damning article against fair trade, which talked about how fair trade, one of the checkoff programs was that the bathrooms are clean when the investigations are done. And what they found was that somebody checked off that the bathrooms were clean. Problem was there were no bathrooms. So they were falsifying the information. You also had that maybe only 10% of the locations were actually being reviewed. So we do not go based on any of these certifications that take place. Same thing with Rainforest Alliance. I actually have photos by a researcher, uh, photos and video of children in so-called Rainforest Alliance certified locations where children were working and have cuts on their arms and legs from the machetes. So unfortunately, the certifications are not living up to the ideals. A lot of them have become watered down. So our chocolate list is basically just made up of country of origin. And what it does is it's saying we're not recommending chocolate where slavery and the child labor is the most prevalent. So let's say in the past, 10 years ago, we would have had any company from Brazil on the list. Now it's not that way because we can't, because now we know the problem is starting there as well. So we have our list, which is transparent. So you let you know if we recommend it. If we don't recommend it, we tell you why. We reach out to the companies. Every company that makes our list has to make at least one vegan chocolate. Most of them all do, meaning most companies do have at least one vegan chocolate. We also have it as a free app. So if you have an iPhone or an Android, it's a free app as well that you can download. And we update it every month. So if there's a company that you love that's not on the list, you can email us and we'll check the company out. We basically just ask them what is the country of origin. And no, we don't let things like Switzerland and France work because no, cacao beans do not come from those countries. But when we talk about animals who are raised and killed for food, one of the things we don't really talk about is the communities that are impacted by that. How many people here are familiar with the term environmental racism? Most of you are. So basically, environmental racism is something that we have in our area, right? We look at East Palo Alto, where they had like a paint stripping facility. You know, toxic waste was there, but in Palo Alto, you don't really have anything like that. So we look at environmental racism as basically being when one community has more negative pollutants than another community does. And those pollutants are primarily in Black and Brown and Indigenous communities. So the same thing occurs when we look at animals raised and killed for food. So in North Carolina, you have some of the all the pig farms are located in Black and Indigenous communities, where the public there suffers from nosebleeds and headaches, respiratory issues, because they're living so close to these facilities. And as somebody who's investigated pig farms, I can tell you that it is the most unbelievable smell. It's impossible to even relate to what it smelled like. But it would take me, when I investigate the farms, I'd have to wash my hair like 3 times just to get the smell out of my hair and out of my skin. In the chicken farms, the ammonia is so bad in those farms that your lungs burn afterwards. Here in California, we have a very similar situation in the Central Valley, right? We're #1 in dairy producing, and where is that taking place? In the Central Valley. When you consider that one dairy cow produces 120 pounds of wet manure per cow, and a farm like this has about 17,000 cows on it, we're talking about 120 pounds per day from a dairy cow of manure. So when you have farms that large with no waste treatment system, it's impacting those community members. And who's predominantly living there are the Latinx community members, where we have some of the highest rates of asthma in the state taking place, primarily because of the dairy industry. So this is an issue that has gotten more attention recently, and we are grateful for that, but not in the context in which it's happened. As a vegan organization that's encouraging people to eat more produce, right? And as someone like me who went vegan because I didn't want to contribute to the suffering of non-human animals, I have that same lens when I look at all the food I eat. Is there suffering involved in the food that I eat? And if so, what can I do to either eliminate from my diet, or what can I do to help change things? And when it comes to produce, I can't eliminate it from my diet, right? I can say I don't want to contribute to the suffering of non-human animals. That's easy. Don't consume animals. But when it comes to produce, what do? I don't have the privilege, or I don't know that I would want the privilege of owning property, because this is stolen land. This is the Ohlone land. I should have started out by recognizing whose land we're on. But I can't grow my own food. So I have some obligation to the people who are feeding me. And quite frankly, everybody in this room does, unless you grow and eat only your own food. Farm workers in the state of California and across the country are some of the most abused workers in the world. And they're often overlooked. Although they're considered essential workers, they never receive any of the privileges of essential workers, not during the lockdown during COVID, and certainly not now. Farm workers not only feed us in California, they not only feed us across the United States, they feed people around the world. And we're talking about farm workers who experience things such as sexual harassment on a daily basis. Farm workers who the average lifespan is 49 years old. So I'm 52. I've already surpassed the average lifespan of a farm worker. A young woman I spoke to earlier this week, her father, she's the daughter and granddaughter of farm workers. Her father died at 33, didn't even make it to the 49. And these are the people who are feeding us. And why is this happening to them? It's happening because of their working conditions. It's happening because of the lack of benefits that these workers receive. And the reality is that how these workers are often paid, they can be paid hourly, but a lot of times these farm workers are being paid by how much they can pick, right? So how much did you fill your bucket, and how many times did you fill that bucket? And maybe I'm paying you $1.25 per bucket of strawberries that you pick. So that means that all the farm workers that are older or who are frail aren't going to make as much money as the other farm workers. A lot of them don't have health insurance. A lot of them suffer wage theft, which means my farm hired a contractor to hire these workers. Well, that contractor just skipped town with everybody's wages, and there's nothing they can do about it. They also didn't get, they just recently are starting to get overtime. But now we're hearing in Sonoma County that they're not really paying overtime. They're just bringing in more workers instead of standing by the workers who've worked for them for a long time. And again, we'll touch on this in a minute, but farm workers also, very few of them actually have access to the foods in which they pick themselves, meaning that they don't have access to fresh fruits and vegetables many times. So Coalition of Immokalee Workers, is anybody familiar with them? They are the farm worker. They are a phenomenal organization based in Florida. And if you'd ever heard anything about the boycott against Taco Bell or against Wendy's for the tomatoes, or you've read any articles about tomato growers, that's the Coalition of Immokalee Workers. And basically, they have been doing incredible work focusing on fast food restaurants and grocery stores. And what they're asking for is to be paid a penny more per pound for the tomatoes that they pick. It's called the Fair Food Program. 1 penny more per pound. And the reason why is because their research showed that 1 penny more per pound has made an actual difference in the lives of the farm workers. Just 1 penny more per pound. And who's fighting it? Wendy's is. So we encourage everybody to boycott Wendy's, but to tell Wendy's why you're boycotting them. Because they are not respecting and paying farm workers what they deserve to be paid. There's also a grocery store chain in the southeast called Publix. We don't have it out here. So currently this is an active boycott for the farm workers. One of the things that Food Empowerment Project does every year is we do a school supply drive for the children of farm workers. And we do it not as an act of charity. We do it as a way to help right an injustice that's taking place against farm workers. And we do it because we want these kids to know what superstars they are, because we know that their families are sacrificing a tremendous amount so that they can succeed in this world. We are very lucky that Assemblymember Clara has always been a participant in the school supply drive, and we've actually had drop-off locations at some of the libraries in San Jose. So we're very lucky to have his support. But we donate, we did water bottles during COVID so that the kids could have their own very water bottles. Because again, think about it this way. If you have had kids or you have kids, many times, you know, when the school started opening again, the water fountains weren't working in the schools, right? Because they're worried about the spread of COVID. So what about those kids who didn't have water bottles, right? They'd have nothing to drink all day. So something as simple as a water bottle symbolized some type of privilege for these children, some way for them to be able to have a chance at a good education without being thirsty or about not wanting to eat because they would get thirsty, and then what would they do? So this is something that we felt good about doing, and predominantly the farm workers that we work with are indigenous, meaning that they're indigenous to Mexico, predominantly a state in Mexico called Oaxaca. And these farm workers are at additional disadvantage than regular farm workers are, because a lot of the services, especially during COVID and during the fires, which I will mention, are done in English or Spanish. But these farm workers don't speak English or Spanish. They speak their indigenous languages such as Triqui or Mixteco, and there's a handful of others. So these farm workers are way more at a disadvantage. And at this point in time, California has done nothing to acknowledge that a lot of these farm workers who are out there feeding us are not getting the benefits because we're not catching up to where it is that they are at and who it is that's picking our food. One of the things that Food Empowerment Project was involved in was the change of something called the 50-mile regulation. And basically what this was, so we have labor camps. Did y'all know we have labor camps in California? The 50-mile regulation said that when farm workers are living in these labor camps, when the picking season is over, they have to move 50 miles away from that labor camp to be able to move back the next year. So let's give an example. Santa Cruz, Watsonville, I should say. There is a labor camp that is located between a correctional facility and a dump. And that facility closes, closes in, I guess I should say it opens in May and it closes in like November, right? Because they're picking and that's when the picking season is over. So that means that the children who are in school had to be pulled out of school when the labor camp closed, right? So there was no way for them to complete their education. Every year they would start school in May and then they would be pulled out in like November. So children from that area were not graduating at all. There was one young woman in 20 years that graduated from high school because of this system that was in place. So we were able to get this regulation changed, right? Guess what? It comes up in 2024 again. So we're already starting working to try and figure out how we can make sure to finally do away with this 50-mile regulation. And if you sign up to our email list in the back, we'd love to get you engaged and try and help again. But this is something that has truly impacted the education of these children. And the young woman I mentioned before, she's again the granddaughter and daughter of farm workers, and she actually is getting her doctorate right now. She didn't live in the labor camps, but she's very well aware of how difficult it is. So let's talk about Half Moon Bay, because it's hard not to right now. It's hard not to recognize what happened in Half Moon Bay and the tragedy that occurred there. And I'll tell you, this is my first public talk since Half Moon Bay occurred, um, where one of the farm workers killed some other farm workers at a mushroom farm. And it's so hard to hear someone like Gavin Newsom, who seems for the most part to be very in touch with what's going on in the state, be shocked at the conditions in which the farm workers were living. I've been speaking for my entire 15 years about the way that farm workers in the state of California live. Many are homeless, many live in cardboard boxes, many live in pickup trucks. Only a small percentage live in the labor camps. The conditions in which they live is deplorable. Now, obviously, there's no way in the world I would ever say killing somebody is okay, but you can understand the fear somebody might experience if they make $9 an hour or so, to being told that they're going to get $100 fine. Because that's what the headlines keep saying, is all of the shooting was over $100, as if $100 isn't a lot of money. And those types of headlines speak with privilege. They speak with as if $100 is not a lot of money. That is heartbreaking, that there's no empathy for what's happening there. And then again, we're learning more about the passing of the buck of who's responsible for where they live and how they live. We dealt with that in changing the 50-mile regulation. Nobody could figure out who was in charge of it. They couldn't find the legislative history for it. There's like this void when it comes to the people who basically are putting food on the tables of people in this country. So what's happening in Half Moon Bay is I hopeful. I mean, I said this though when farm workers were considered essential workers during the lockdown, that there will be some recognition for the farm workers and all that they're doing and all that they're doing without. So again, we watch this with hope, but with also more determination to use it as a way to force some type of change in this state when it comes to farm workers, their housing, their lives in which they go, what they're putting up with. I mean, I don't know how many of you have really experienced needing to pay amount of money that you simply know you do not have, and the amount of fear and whose responsibility that really comes from. If one worker hit that farm worker's tractor, why would it be the farm workers that are responsible for that? Like, who trained them, one? And two, this is the thing. I'm sorry, I promise I will change. But this is the thing that I always don't understand is I'm very much for uh, free healthcare. I'm for free education. I believe in all of that. But what I don't understand is why the state continuously allows growers to get away with not paying workers a living wage, to where the state has to say, well, we'll build labor camps because we know you aren't paying them enough. So state will build a labor camp so you don't have to continue to pay them enough. How they can go into a location like in Half Moon Bay and see the conditions they're working in and not already fine and charge and put in jail the people who were forcing other human beings to live that way, much less the human beings that were making them money. It's inexcusable. So I just want to briefly talk about COVID and farm workers as well. Again, my organization, we were based in Sonoma County for a little while. And when we talk about COVID, one of the things that we talked about a lot was underlying conditions, right? Like if you have underlying conditions, you're more likely to have COVID, you're more likely to get it and worse symptoms and stuff like that. The Latino population, you can see here, small percentage of the population in Sonoma County. But if you look at the percentage having COVID who didn't have any underlying conditions, 78% of the population. Now, in case you didn't know this, Sonoma County is known for the wine. The wineries during COVID were having the farm workers live in bunk beds, right? COVID's going on, and the farm workers who are picking your grapes are living in or sleeping in bunk beds. They're traveling together in cars. They are riding, together to get to these locations. I should mention too that some farms in the Central Valley, when farm workers asked for protective equipment, were laughed at because they were told COVID didn't really exist. So when we talk about the confusion that was created by our former president, a lot of lives were taken and a lot of farm worker lives were taken at that. So again, because of the conditions in which farm workers are forced to live and work, had higher rates of COVID. We also had farm workers who were forced to work during the fires and the big fires that took place in Sonoma County. They were finding loopholes in which to force the farm workers. They were saying, this is a mandatory evacuation area. But everybody would have to leave. Residents would have to leave. But they still made the farm workers go in and pick the grapes. Now, there's an organization, North Bay Jobs with Justice, which we're a member of, that actually has been working to make sure that farm workers are now going to be paid more if they're forced to work in hazardous locations, which we're very relieved that is happening. So I'm going to skip on to food apartheid now. So again, food apartheid is basically, if you've heard the term food deserts. Food Empowerment Project doesn't use the term food desert because we don't think it accurately reflects what's taking place. And again, these are communities where you have higher access to liquor stores, convenience stores, but not much access to healthy foods. It's also where there are high rates of things like type 2 diabetes and more dietary related diseases taking place. The reason why we don't use food deserts is because it seems to be a USDA term that primarily focuses on location, 3 miles from a grocery store, 3 miles from here, when really the reality is so much of what's happening is based on racism and discrimination. The vast majority of people experiencing food apartheid are Black, Brown, and Indigenous community members. So this is just to give you one quick example. This is a convenience store. It's blurry because I wasn't allowed to take the photo and I had already done it. But basically, this is what a lot of community members, including many in Santa Clara County, deal with, which is where the liquor stores, convenience stores, are the only places people can really get healthy foods, meaning fresh fruits and fresh vegetables. So you have a lot of these. You may see it yourself. You'll stop in a liquor store and maybe they have like a little basket of bananas or they have some produce there because they may be the only place for community members to get healthy foods. And so here you have, some potatoes, some apples, and some onions. And that's really it for this community. This was taken in Vallejo. So in Santa Clara County, when I first moved here in 2007, again, I had 2 liquor stores across the street from each other, 2 where I lived. And I thought, this used to be known as the Valley of Heart's Delight. Is this really an area where this truly is happening? We have such wealthy companies here. Does this happen? So we gathered up some volunteers and we went out and surveyed and we did a comparison between high income areas and low income areas by zip code in Santa Clara County. And because we have a high Latinx population, we also made sure the Latinx community members' produce was included. So this was the actual survey tool that we used. We checked to see if it was organic, non-organic, what was the quantity, what were the prices, and then other comments. We put out a report on our findings. What we found was that community members pretty much didn't, this is a long time ago. Okay, this was like 10 years ago. Is that right? When this came out. So I'm not saying this is brand new data, but I am saying that I think things may have gotten worse because I feel like the disparity between rich and poor in this county has gotten a little bit worse. So basically there was no access to organic produce in the lower income communities. You also didn't have meat and dairy alternatives. And obviously we surveyed that, right? Because we're a vegan organization. We don't want any harm to come to non-human animals, but also because many Black, Brown, and Indigenous people are what many people term lactose intolerant, but we call it lactose normal. And the reason why is because too many times the onus of something being wrong with you is displaced on Black and brown people. Like there's something wrong with us for not being able to digest the milk of another species. When in reality, my ancestors from the Americas, we did not consume dairy products. Columbus brought the cows over, right? The cows are not native to the Americas. So who brought them over was Columbus. So my ancestors, didn't consume milk. And that's the same for a lot of community members. So if you consider these liquor stores and convenience stores not offering things like plant-based milks, that is a disservice to the community because you have families who are possibly sending their kids to school with stomach aches or the kids, which is a very common thing, kids just not eating then because they don't want to get sick in school or have people staring at them. The way that the survey looked at the information in terms of, is there the same number of liquor stores, grocery stores in a community, looked pretty equal, right? That's the chart on the left. But the reality is that many of the liquor stores in Santa Clara County are being considered grocery stores because it's voluntary. They can choose however it is they want to identify. So if I'm a convenience store that predominantly sells liquor and I want to be across the street from another one, I can just call myself a grocery store instead of a liquor store. We did focus groups in San Jose, which were the most impacted communities. We did 3, all conducted in Spanish. We put out our report, finding, again, people were interested in organic. One of the things that people talked about doing was called trique. I'm sorry, not trique, truque, which was basically a lot of the people who lived in the lower income communities would basically rely on each other to go grocery shopping for each other. And it wouldn't be like, okay, well, I bought you tortillas last time, now you got to buy me this. Everybody just kind of trusted each other, that it would all come back around to help the community. We also found that the biggest barrier for people in accessing healthy foods had nothing to do with proximity. It was 100% the cost of the food. So that's why we started encouraging living wages. Because one, we don't need the prices of food to go, well, maybe right now we need prices of food to go down, but for the most part, we don't need prices of food to go down, especially when you consider farm workers. We need equity. We need everybody on a more level playing field. If we want everybody to be able to thrive and be healthy, we need to make sure people can afford that food. We also found that people from immigrant communities were eating healthier in the countries they came from. So families who were used to being able to buy fresh tomatoes didn't want to be cooking with tomato sauce that was available at the convenience store. They wanted to cook with fresh, healthier foods. They also were interested in meat and dairy alternatives, I guess, especially because San Jose has so many vegan restaurants downtown that a lot of them talked about their kids wanting to eat vegan. We did a similar work in Vallejo, where there you had the whole community of Vallejo lacks access to healthy foods, but far more problem with lack of grocery stores in that area. And Vallejo has just gotten worse since then. More grocery stores have shut down. We also found when we were doing our work in Vallejo, and I've often wondered if this happened in San Jose, but basically Safeway grocery store, they left downtown Vallejo and they were located near a senior living facility in Black and brown community. They left that downtown location and they moved a few miles away. And when they left, they put what's called a restrictive deed on their former property, which prevented any grocery store from moving in for 15 years. This is legal. It's not ethical, but it's legal. We have found that they have done this in other communities, 30 years, 65 years is the most we've seen, where they literally prevent any grocery store from moving into their community. This meant in Vallejo, there were teenagers who never knew what it was like to have a grocery store. You had parents who were making bargains and deals with convenience store owners to try and get produce for their families. So we have a campaign against Safeway demanding that they change this policy. So when we look at lack of access to healthy foods, one of the things in terms of solutions that we see is leaning towards worker cooperative models, where you have grocery stores like Mandela Grocery Cooperative in Oakland, where the people who are the owners of it make the decisions, and they're vested in the community because they're part of that community and they believe in that community. So Mandela is able to do things like, EBT days or seniors days where people get like 50% off produce because they are involved and they care about the community. We also believe very strongly in people growing their own foods, to be off a system that was never meant for them. So one of the other areas I just want to mention in talking about workers is that Food Empowerment Project has had a campaign against Amy's Kitchen for about a year now. And for those of you who are vegan and vegetarian, you may know Amy's Kitchen makes a lot of frozen foods, canned foods, and they have been treating their workers horribly from Santa Rosa to here in San Jose, where workers have struggled to get things like lunch breaks. Their emergency exits have been closed, sexual harassment, bullying, and when the workers in San Jose were on the verge of organizing and becoming a union, they fired all 300 workers. So we are encouraging and asking everybody to please boycott Amy's. They've devastated a lot of these workers in San Jose. came from the hospitality industry who were laid off during COVID, thought they were getting a good job with a company called Amy's, and now they're struggling to find work. So, what you can do if you have access to healthy foods and you don't want to hurt animals, go vegan. Shop with care. Again, try not to support corporations that violate human rights and animal rights. I know that's hard. We used to say, don't do this, and I realize it's so hard these days when companies are buying other companies. Lend your voices to the needs of farm workers. Support their corporate campaigns. Support regulations and legislation that help them. Choose organic when you can. It doesn't necessarily mean the farm workers are treated any better, but it does mean they're not being doused with agricultural chemicals. Choose ethical chocolate. You have our list to use. Please avoid buying single-use plastic water bottles. Again, reusables, non-plastic bags when you shop. Support your farmers market. We are so lucky in the Santa Clara County to have some of the best farmers markets. We really encourage you to try to support those black and brown farmers who are selling, because they have had more of a disadvantage of being in business than others. Support living wages so we can help create more equity. Check out we have information on our website on bananas, coffee, palm oil, wine. And for bananas, coffee, wine, and actually avocados, we also have recommendations on companies that we feel comfortable recommending. Speak out about the problems of food injustices, fill out comment cards, use your voice, get involved, sign up to our e-newsletter, and spread the word, because it's so important that if we believe these things, that's one thing, right? Like, it's your individual choices that make a difference, but our collective voices together are what has the power to transform industries. We've seen it time and time again, and we need to continue wielding that towards justice. So I know I've given you all a lot of information, and I just hope that you understand. And instead of thinking of the O as overwhelmed, look at it as O for opportunities. We have the opportunities to make a difference every single day with every single meal we have. We want people to do what we call eat your ethics. If you're eating something, decide, does this meet my ethics or not? And if not, what can I do differently, or what can I do to change things? So I have a laptop from Apple. I have a lot of issues with Apple and their human rights stuff. But you know what? I write Apple and I tell Apple, like, this is important. I read about this, about what you're doing here. They have to hear from us, because they've gotten away too long. And I don't just mean Apple, I mean everybody. They've gotten away too long thinking we don't care, that all we care is about cheap prices. But for those of us who care about human, non-human animals locally, globally, we must start speaking out, because we have the power to change. If anything that the Gen Z generation has taught us is that we do have the ability to change things, because they are changing things and they need our support. Thank you.